Commander Emily Bradford stood at the entrance of the alien vessel Star Whisper with her hand trembling slightly. This was the most important moment of her entire career. She had trained for years to represent humanity in this first major diplomatic meeting with the Keelian Empire. The stakes were enormous. A trade agreement with the Keelians could transform Earth's future. Advanced technology, medicine, and resources were all on the table. Emily took a deep breath and stepped forward onto the ship's metallic ramp. Lieutenant David Foster followed close behind her. He was a decorated soldier with 15 years of military experience. His uniform was perfectly pressed and his posture was impeccable. David had been chosen specifically to accompany Emily as a security detail and to show humanity's strength and discipline. He was calm and professional, the kind of man who never complained, no matter what challenges he faced. Emily felt confident having him there. Together, they represented humanity at its finest. As they entered the main corridor of the ship, they were greeted by a towering figure. This was Thex, the protocol officer of the Keelian Empire. Thex was unlike anything Emily had ever seen. His body was made of crystalline material that seemed to glow with an inner light. His form was tall and elegant, standing nearly 8 feet in height. His movements were fluid and precise, like watching liquid glass move with purpose and intention. Despite his otherworldly appearance, his voice was surprisingly calm and measured when he spoke to Emily. Thex welcomed them aboard the Star Whisper with formal courtesy. He explained the basic rules and protocols they would need to follow during their stay. He showed them where the conference rooms were located. He described the dining facilities and the rest areas. Everything seemed fine at first. Emily listened carefully to every word, taking mental notes about Keelian customs and traditions. She wanted to make sure she understood everything correctly so there would be no misunderstandings that could damage the negotiations. Then Thex's expression changed slightly. His crystalline face seemed to harden. He turned to look directly at David and spoke in a formal tone that made it clear this was not a request but a statement of law. Thex told David that according to ancient Keelian regulations, only beings with official refuge status were permitted to sit anywhere on the ship. These rules had been established thousands of years ago, long before humans had any contact with the Keelian Empire. Since humanity had not yet been granted refuge status, David would not be allowed to sit at any time during his stay on the Star Whisper. Emily's face went pale. She felt her stomach drop. This was completely unexpected and entirely unreasonable. She immediately began to protest. She explained to Thex that this rule was unfair and impractical. She pointed out that David was a decorated military officer and deserved respect. She argued that humans should be treated with basic dignity and consideration. She told Thex that this kind of treatment could damage the possibility of a successful trade agreement between their two species. Thex listened to every word Emily said with his full attention. However, his response was unwavering and absolute. He explained that the law was very clear. Refuge status was something that had to be earned according to Keelian tradition. It could not be given as a favor or an exception. Thex said that if humans wanted to be treated as beings with refuge status, then humans would have to prove themselves worthy of that status through their actions and their character. He added that these laws applied equally to all species that visited the Star Whisper. No exceptions had ever been made, and no exceptions would be made now, no matter who was asking. Emily felt anger rising inside her chest. She wanted to argue more. She wanted to demand that this ridiculous rule be changed immediately. But she also understood that pushing too hard might make things worse. Diplomatic relations were delicate. One wrong move could jeopardize everything. She looked at David to see how he was reacting to this situation. David's face was completely calm. His expression showed no sign of frustration or anger or disappointment. He simply nodded slowly and accepted what Thex had said. David understood military hierarchy and rules, even when those rules seemed unfair. He was a soldier and soldiers followed orders. If the law of the Keelian Empire said he must stand, then he would stand. There was no point in fighting against something that was clearly not going to change. David turned to Emily and gave her a small nod. He then walked to a nearby wall in the corridor and took up a standing position. He stood perfectly straight, his shoulders back, his chin level. His military training made this seem almost natural for him, even though Emily could see the determination in his eyes. She realized that David was making a choice to handle this with dignity and professionalism, no matter how unfair the situation might be. Emily felt a mixture of emotions. She was angry at the Keelian protocols. She was frustrated by the stubbornness of Thex and his ancient laws. But she also felt admiration for David's strength and composure. She made a decision right then that she would work to change the situation. She would prove to the Keelians that humans deserved better treatment. She would show them through her negotiations and her diplomacy that humanity was a species worthy of respect. As Emily prepared herself mentally for the challenges ahead, she glanced back at David standing by the wall. He caught her eye and gave her the smallest hint of a reassuring smile. He was telling her without words that he would be fine, that she should focus on her mission. Emily nodded in return and then turned to follow Thex deeper into the ship toward the conference rooms where the negotiations would soon begin. The real test of humanity was about to start. The hours that followed seemed to stretch into an eternity. David remained standing in the corridor where he had positioned himself, maintaining his rigid posture with the discipline of a soldier who had endured far worse conditions. Emily had explained to him that the morning negotiations would begin in a few minutes, and they would move through various conference rooms throughout the day. David simply nodded and prepared himself mentally for what was to come. He had stood for long hours before during military training exercises. This would be no different, he told himself, even though he knew deep down that this situation was unique and challenging in ways he had never experienced. The first conference room was large and impressive. Massive windows looked out onto the stars beyond the ship. The walls were smooth and seemed to shimmer with a soft blue light. Around a long table sat several Keelian officials and representatives from other alien species who had already established trade relationships with the Keelian Empire. Emily took her seat at the table and everyone else sat down comfortably in their chairs. Everyone except David. He stood at attention near the door, his back straight, his eyes focused ahead. The contrast was immediately obvious to everyone in the room. As the meeting began, Emily noticed the subtle glances directed at David. Some of the alien beings looked at him with sympathy in their eyes. Others seemed indifferent, as if they saw standing humans every day. A few of them seemed to regard David with something that looked almost like pity. Emily felt her anger building again, but she forced herself to concentrate on the negotiations. She had a job to do, and she would not let this unfair situation distract her from her mission. The first discussion was about trade routes and transportation agreements. Emily explained how humanity could benefit from Keelian technology and how Earth could offer valuable resources in return. She spoke clearly and intelligently, presenting data and research that showed the mutual benefits of cooperation between their two worlds. The Keelian officials listened carefully. They asked questions and requested more information. The conversation was productive and professional. Emily felt confident that they were making progress. However, as the morning turned into afternoon, Emily began to notice something else. David's posture was beginning to show signs of fatigue. His shoulders, which had been perfectly squared back, were now only slightly squared. His breathing seemed heavier than before. Emily could see that standing for so many hours was taking a physical toll on him. She wanted to suggest a break, but she worried that if she drew attention to David's condition, it might make things worse. She decided to push forward and hope that a break would come soon. Around midday, one of the Keelian officials called for a recess. Everyone stood up from the table, and the aliens began to move around the room, discussing the points that had been raised. Emily immediately looked toward David. His face looked slightly pale, and she could see small beads of perspiration on his forehead. She walked over to him quickly and quietly asked if he was okay. David assured her that he was fine, that he could continue standing for as long as necessary. Emily admired his courage, but she also felt worried about his well-being. During the lunch break, Emily, Thex, and several other officials moved to a dining area. Long tables were filled with various foods from different worlds. There were Keelian dishes made from crystallized minerals and light-based nutrients. There were colorful fruits and vegetables from other planets. There was fresh water and various beverages. Everyone sat down to eat. David followed the group but remained standing, even though Emily silently encouraged him to find a seat. He simply shook his head slightly and continued to stand near a wall, watching but not eating. Emily felt guilt rising inside her. Here she was enjoying a meal while David stood hungry and tired. She quickly filled a plate with food and brought it to him, along with a glass of water. David accepted the items with gratitude and managed to eat and drink while maintaining his standing position. It was awkward and uncomfortable, but David did not complain. He simply did what needed to be done. The afternoon sessions continued with more discussions about technology sharing, resource exchange, and long-term cooperation agreements. Emily presented more information and answered detailed questions from the Keelian representatives. The conversations grew more complex and demanding. Emily found herself concentrating harder as the afternoon progressed. Her mind was working at full capacity to handle the technical details and negotiations. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, During a presentation about Earth's scientific capabilities, David nearly stumbled. His leg shifted unexpectedly, and he had to catch himself against the wall. The movement was small, but several people noticed. Emily's heart jumped with concern. She quickly wrapped up her presentation and suggested another short break. The officials agreed, and everyone left the conference room for a few minutes. Emily rushed to David's side immediately. She could see the exhaustion in his eyes, though he was still trying to hide it. His face was pale, and his uniform was slightly damp with perspiration. Emily told him that they were making good progress and that there would be only a few more hours of discussions before the day ended. David nodded and straightened his posture again, drawing on reserves of strength that Emily could barely imagine. As the final sessions of the day began, Emily noticed something remarkable happening around David. A Keelian crew member walked past and seemed to accidentally leave a specially designed standing support near where David was positioned. The device looked like it was meant to help someone maintain balance while standing. David did not use it directly, but its presence seemed to give him encouragement and support. When the day finally ended and Emily could see that David was completely exhausted, she felt tremendous respect for his dedication and strength. He had stood for nearly 12 hours without complaint, without sitting, without resting. As they walked back to their quarters, Emily promised herself that she would find a way to change this unfair rule. The evening fell slowly across the Star Whisper as the sun from the distant star system gradually disappeared beyond the horizon. Emily and David made their way through the quiet corridors of the ship toward their assigned quarters. David's legs felt heavy, and his entire body ached from standing all day. However, he maintained his composure and did not show any outward signs of his exhaustion. Emily walked beside him, her mind still processing all the information from the day's negotiations. As they walked through the main corridor, something unexpected happened. A Keelian engineer was working on a piece of equipment attached to the wall. When the engineer saw David walking past, he stopped his work and watched for a moment. Then, without saying anything at all, the engineer reached down and picked up a small device that looked like a specially designed standing support. He placed it carefully near a section of wall where David would likely pass during tomorrow's negotiations. The engineer did not acknowledge David directly. He simply nodded slightly and returned to his work as if nothing unusual had occurred. Emily noticed this interaction immediately. She wondered what it meant. Was the engineer being kind, or was he doing something that violated Keelian protocol? She decided not to say anything to David about it, not wanting to complicate the situation further. However, she filed the observation away in her mind. Something was changing. She could feel it. Later that night, Emily sat in her quarters reviewing notes from the day's discussions. She was preparing for tomorrow's conversations about technology transfer and resource sharing. She heard a soft chime at her door and opened it to find a Vrelian diplomat standing in the hallway. The Vrelian was a being with 4 arms and skin that shimmered like oil on water. His species had been trading with the Keelians for over 50 years, so he had experience with their customs and traditions. The Vrelian introduced himself as Krell and asked if he could speak with Emily privately. Emily invited him inside and Krell entered her quarters. He explained that he had observed Emily and David during the day's negotiations. He said that what David was doing by standing all day without complaint was remarkable and showed great strength of character. Krell told Emily that among his people, such behavior would be remembered and honored. He offered to give her some advice about how to navigate Keelian culture more effectively. Krell explained that the Keelians valued many things, but above all else they valued dignity, honor, and the ability to endure hardship without losing one's composure. He said that David's refusal to complain or show weakness while standing all day was actually earning him respect among the Keelian crew, even though they could not express it openly due to their strict protocols. Krell warned Emily that if David showed signs of weakness or complained about the standing requirement, it would actually work against humanity's position in the negotiations. However, if David continued to stand with dignity and strength, it would change how the Keelians viewed humanity as a species. Emily felt a mixture of relief and sadness hearing this. She was relieved that David's suffering had meaning and purpose. She was sad that humanity had to prove itself through such unfair circumstances. Krell seemed to sense her feelings and placed one of his 4 hands gently on her shoulder. He told her that all species had to prove themselves in one way or another. The Vrelians had faced similar challenges when they first met the Keelians. What mattered was how a species responded to those challenges. After Krell left her quarters, Emily spent the rest of the evening thinking about what he had told her. She realized that David was not just a soldier standing by a wall. He was a representative of all humanity. His actions were teaching the Keelians something important about human character. She felt proud of David, but she also felt the weight of responsibility. Tomorrow would be another long day of standing for him. The next morning, Emily and David began another full day of negotiations. This time, Emily noticed something different about how the Keelian crew members interacted with them. When they passed through the corridors, several crew members nodded at David in a way that seemed respectful rather than dismissive. One Keelian worker offered David a special drink that supposedly helped with physical endurance. The worker did not explain where the drink came from or why he was offering it, but his gesture clearly suggested support and solidarity. During a break in the afternoon negotiations, a Vrelian crew member who worked on the Star Whisperer approached David when Emily was not paying attention. The Vrelian offered David water in a formal way that suggested respect rather than sympathy. This small gesture meant a great deal. It showed that other species recognized David's strength and wanted to acknowledge it in whatever subtle ways they could within the constraints of Keelian law. Most surprisingly, Emily began to notice changes in Thex's behavior. The protocol officer remained strict about the standing requirement, continuing to enforce the ancient Keelian law with unwavering consistency. However, when no other officials were watching, Thex's rigid posture seemed to soften slightly when looking at David. There was something in Thex's crystalline eyes that suggested approval or perhaps even admiration. By the end of the second day, Emily understood what was happening. David's quiet dignity and his refusal to break under an unfair rule was elevating humanity in the eyes of everyone aboard the Star Whisperer. The aliens were not seeing David as a weak human force to stand by unjust rules. Instead, they were seeing a soldier of remarkable strength and character. They were seeing a representative of a species that could endure hardship without losing honor or composure. Emily realized that they were winning the respect of the galaxy, not through weapons or clever words, but through one man's quiet strength and determination. As she watched David standing by the wall at the end of the day, completely exhausted but maintaining perfect posture, she understood that humanity had already achieved something important. They had proven themselves. The third day of negotiations began like all the others, with Emily taking her seat at the conference table and David taking his position standing against the wall. However, there was a noticeable difference in the atmosphere aboard the Star Whisperer. The tension that had filled the ship during the first 2 days seemed to have lessened. The Keelian officials seemed more relaxed and open to discussion. The representatives from other alien species seemed more willing to support humanity's position on various trade issues. Emily conducted several important negotiations throughout the morning. She discussed medical technology exchange programs that could benefit both humanity and the Keelian Empire. She talked about resource-sharing agreements that would provide Earth with rare minerals needed for advanced technology development. She explained how humans could help Keelian scientists with biological research that had been difficult for them to pursue on their own. The conversations flowed more naturally than they had before. It seemed that the Keelians were genuinely interested in working with humanity. By the afternoon, Emily began to understand that something significant had shifted in the attitudes of the Keelian leadership. The head official, a senior Keelian named Vorlak, started making more generous offers than Emily had expected. He suggested that humanity could have access to certain technologies that were normally reserved only for species that had been trading with the Keelians for decades. He spoke positively about the qualities he had observed in the human representatives. He mentioned that he valued the strength and composure that he had witnessed. Emily felt her heart racing as she realized that they were on the verge of achieving an agreement that was far better than what the Earth government had hoped for. This was beyond her expectations. She wanted to understand what had caused this dramatic change in the Keelians' attitude toward humanity. She suspected it had something to do with David's standing, but she was not entirely sure how one man standing all day could possibly change the minds of an entire alien government. As the final negotiation session of the day was concluding, Vorlak stood up and made an announcement. He said that the Keelian leadership had been impressed by the dedication and professionalism shown by the human delegation. He stated that the negotiations had been more productive than anticipated. Most importantly, he said that the Keelian High Council had decided to present a special proposal to the human government. But first, Vorlak said, there was someone who wanted to speak with Lieutenant David Foster privately. Everyone in the conference room turned to look at David. His expression remained calm, but Emily could see that he was surprised by this announcement. Thex, the protocol officer, had moved to stand near David. Thex gestured for David to follow him out of the conference room. Emily felt a sudden surge of anxiety. She did not know what was about to happen. She watched as David and Thex left the room together, moving into a quiet corridor away from the other officials and representatives. Emily wanted to follow them, but she knew it would be inappropriate. Instead, she remained seated at the table, her mind racing with possibilities and concerns. What could Thex possibly want to discuss with David? Was this something positive or was there a problem? Emily's hands felt slightly shaky as she tried to maintain her composure in front of the other officials. In the corridor outside the conference room, David stood facing Thex. The Keelian protocol officer seemed different somehow. His crystalline form seemed to glow slightly brighter than usual. His posture, which had always been rigid and formal, now seemed to carry a sense of purpose and perhaps even emotion, if such a thing was possible for a being made of crystalline material. Thex looked directly at David for a long moment without speaking. Then, slowly and deliberately, Thex reached into a small pouch that was attached to his form. From the pouch, he withdrew a piece of parchment. This was unusual and significant. In an age of digital communication and holographic displays, physical parchment was a rarity. Parchment was reserved for matters of great importance and tradition. The fact that Thex was holding parchment suggested that whatever message was written on it was extremely important. Thex held the parchment out toward David. His movements were slow and deliberate, as if this was a moment of great significance. There was something in the way Thex moved that suggested respect and perhaps even honor. David reached out slowly and took the parchment from Thex's crystalline hands. The paper felt real and substantial, different from anything digital or holographic. Thex then did something completely unexpected. The protocol officer, who had been so stern and unyielding about the standing requirement, nodded to David. It was a simple gesture, a slight bowing of his head, but the meaning was clear. This was a gesture of acknowledgement. This was a gesture of respect. This was a gesture that transcended the differences between species and the formality of protocol. It was one being honoring another being for their strength and character. Before David could respond, Thex turned and walked away, leaving David alone in the corridor holding the parchment. David looked down at the paper in his hands, wondering what message could possibly be so important that it needed to be delivered in person, on physical parchment, by the very officer who had enforced the harsh standing requirement. David's hands felt slightly tremulous as he held the parchment. He had stood for 3 full days without complaint. He had endured exhaustion and pain. He had maintained his dignity and composure despite unfair treatment. Now, in this quiet moment in the corridor of an alien ship far from Earth, David held in his hands something that he sensed would change everything. The parchment felt warm in his hands. David took a deep breath and prepared himself to read the message that Thex had given him. He had no idea what the note would say, but he knew that this moment would be significant. Whatever was written on this parchment would carry meaning that extended far beyond just his personal experience. This moment would affect humanity's relationship with the Keelian Empire. David carefully unfolded the parchment and began to read the words that were written there. His eyes widened as he understood the true meaning of what Thex had done by standing with him, by supporting him, and now by delivering this message. David's hands trembled slightly as he held the parchment and began to read the words written in clear Keelian script, which had been translated to English through a small holographic device embedded in the paper. The message was brief but profoundly meaningful. The words read, "Your standing has elevated humanity in our eyes. Tomorrow the Keelian High Council will vote on granting humans refuge status. You have earned your seat and far more. Stand tall, Lieutenant David Foster. You have changed us." This document is signed by Protocol Officer Thex and witnessed by 7 other Keelian officials. David read the words 3 times, each time feeling a deeper sense of meaning and purpose. His eyes grew slightly moist as he realized that his 3 days of standing had not been in vain. Every hour of exhaustion, every moment of physical pain, every second of maintaining his dignity had served a purpose far greater than he had imagined. He had not just represented the human military. He had represented all of humanity, and in doing so, he had changed the minds and hearts of an entire alien civilization. The parchment felt heavy in David's hands, but the weight was not physical. It was the weight of responsibility and honor. He understood that this document would become historically significant. Future generations would read about this moment. Children on Earth would learn about the day when one soldier's quiet strength changed humanity's place in the galaxy. David carefully folded the parchment and placed it safely inside his uniform jacket, close to his heart. He stood there in the corridor for a moment, gathering his emotions and preparing himself to return to the conference room. He needed to tell Emily what had happened. He needed to share this incredible news with the person who had stood by his side through this entire experience. When David returned to the conference room, Emily immediately stood up and looked at him with questioning eyes. She could see that something significant had occurred. The expression on David's face told her that the meeting with Thex had not been confrontational or negative. Instead, there was something like wonder and gratitude in his eyes. Emily excused herself from the table and quickly moved over to David to ask him what had happened. David showed Emily the parchment note. Her eyes widened as she read the words. She felt tears beginning to form as she understood the full scope of what had been accomplished. The standing requirement, which had seemed so cruel and unfair just 3 days earlier, had actually been a test. It had been an opportunity for humanity to prove itself worthy of respect and refuge status in the eyes of the Kelian Empire. Emily and David exchanged a long look of understanding that transcended words. They both realized that they had been part of something extraordinary. What had begun as humiliation and injustice had transformed into humanity's greatest diplomatic victory. This victory had not been won through weapons or military strength. It had not been won through clever negotiation or manipulation. It had been won through one man's quiet courage and refusal to break under unfair circumstances. Emily quickly informed Vorlak that the human delegation had received important news regarding the vote on refuge status. Vorlak smiled, which was an unusual expression for a Kelian. He confirmed that the High Council had voted unanimously to grant humanity refuge status. This meant that humans would now be recognized officially as beings worthy of sanctuary and protection under Kelian law. It meant that future human visitors to Kelian ships would be allowed to sit, to rest, and to be treated with the dignity that should have been there from the beginning. Vorlak explained that the Kelian leadership had been testing humanity in a way that they tested all species seeking refuge status. The standing requirement was an ancient tradition designed to measure the character of new species. Only those species that could endure hardship without losing their dignity and composure were deemed worthy of refuge status. The Kelians had observed David's behavior throughout the 3 days, and they had been impressed by his strength, his lack of complaint, and his unwavering professionalism. Emily asked Vorlak why the Kelians had not explained this test beforehand. Vorlak replied that the test would not be genuine if the outcome was known in advance. A true measure of character could only come through facing challenges without knowing whether those challenges would ultimately lead to success or failure. David had not known if his standing would lead to anything positive. He had simply endured, maintained his dignity, and represented his species with honor. Over the following hours, the Kelian leadership and Emily finalized the trade agreement between Earth and the Kelian Empire. The agreement was far more generous and comprehensive than the Earth government had anticipated. Humanity would receive access to advanced medical technology, renewable energy systems, and materials science knowledge that would benefit countless people on Earth. In return, humanity offered unique biological research capabilities and innovative problem-solving approaches that the Kelians valued. The final evening aboard the Star Whisper was spent celebrating the successful negotiation. There was a formal dinner where officials from multiple species gathered to commemorate the achievement. David was invited to sit at the dinner table as an honored guest. When he first sat down in a chair after 3 days of standing, the sensation was almost overwhelming. His legs ached and his muscles felt relieved. But more importantly, sitting in that chair meant something symbolic and powerful. He had earned his seat through his strength and character. As David sat at the dinner table, surrounded by Kelian officials, Vrelian diplomats, and representatives from other alien species, he felt a profound sense of accomplishment. These beings had come to respect him. They had come to respect humanity. They saw humans not as inferior or weak, but as beings capable of extraordinary endurance and honor. Emily sat beside David, and several times throughout the evening, she squeezed his arm gently in acknowledgement of what he had accomplished. She knew that David would forever be remembered in human history as the soldier who changed humanity's relationship with an alien civilization. But more than that, Emily understood that David had proven something fundamental about human character. He had proven that dignity and strength could overcome unfair circumstances. He had proven that quiet courage was sometimes more powerful than any weapon. When the evening concluded, Emily and David prepared to leave the Star Whisper. They gathered their belongings and made their way to the docking area. As they walked through the corridors one final time, various Kelian crew members nodded at David in acknowledgement. Some placed their crystalline hands over their hearts, a gesture of respect in Kelian culture. Thex was waiting for them at the airlock. The protocol officer extended his hand to David in a human gesture of farewell that showed how much the Kelians had learned from this interaction. David shook Thex's crystalline hand firmly, and they exchanged a look of mutual respect. As the shuttle descended toward Earth, Emily looked at David and smiled. She told him that history would remember this moment.